Well, welcome back, everybody, to the last of our Fall 2020 podcasting workshops here at the Virtual Digital Humanities Center. My name is Dr. Pam Lack, and my pronouns are she, her. And before we begin, I'm going to start, as I always do, or I have been doing lately, with our SDSU land acknowledgement. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. Well, it's so lovely to see so many of you back, and I think we also have some new folks as well. For those of you who are new to this series, I'll just sort of put this in some context for you. As I mentioned, this has been a 5-part series on podcasting, and we began back in mid-September thinking about podcasting more generally with an introduction, thinking about what makes for a good podcast, what are the elements of a podcast, things like that. We then together dove into the technical aspects, from recording and different ways of recording, particularly in a pandemic, to 2 different pieces of software for editing. First Audacity, and then Adobe Audition. And this is our last session. We're going to kind of come full circle today and talk about staying on track. So specifically approaches and methods and some sort of tools you can use to sort of keep your podcast organized, especially if you're planning doing sort of multiple episodes of a podcast. And these links should have been put in chat, but what you'll see is all of the slides for this series are available at that tiny URL. And for any of the workshops that you might have missed or want to refer back to, you can go to our YouTube channel, and the link is there as well as in chat to watch the recordings of some of the other podcasting workshops. So what we're going to do today is, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about some ways of staying organized with particular emphasis on file management practices, which I know sounds kind of dry, but it's actually one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm super excited about this. And then I'm going to introduce you to some project management tools and approaches that can help you stay organized and sort of plan your podcasts. Now, I have a lot of content packed into these slides, probably more than an hour's worth. So if we don't cover everything today, you can always refer back to these slides. And for those of you who are podcasting right now, this is also an opportunity to talk a little bit about your practices, your processes, and how it's going. But with that, I'm going to just dive right in with a couple of reminders. And the first is always, as much as possible, use free sound. And here are some links to different types of sound websites. And it's always important that you credit the music and sound you use, whether you're asking friends to create stuff for you or you're grabbing things off of Free Music Archive. And it's a best practice to, when you grab that music or that sound file, to also copy down in like a document of your, sort of like a citation document, all the information about that sound. So the artist, when you downloaded it, where you downloaded it from, so that you can properly give credit to the musicians and the people creating the sound effects that you're using if you're not creating your own. And as another reminder, while the Digital Humanities Center is operating fully virtually this semester during the pandemic, and I anticipate that continuing in the spring, once we do reopen safely, and for those of you who are part of the SDSU community, we do have 2 podcasting studios. So once it's safe to go back in the building, and once it's safe for me to provide access to these studios, you'll be able to book time in the podcasting studios. Okay. So let's talk about files for just a minute, or more than just a minute, actually. What I want to talk about in terms of file management does not just relate to podcasting. It's really relevant to all of your digital files. And the whole point behind this is that if good file management means that you can have quick access to the right file at the right time. How many of you have accidentally submitted the wrong version of a final paper, or accidentally realized you were editing an older version of an essay that you had already updated? These things happen all the time. But with a few sort of seasoned practices, we can avoid those kind of mistakes and make it easier for our future selves. So it allows us quick and accurate access and minimizing confusion over different versions of things. And again, we're going to be talking today in the context of podcasts for the most part, but really this applies to everything you work with. I mean, we're just flooded with digital files these days, whether it's images or texts or things like that. So what I'm going to share with you is really helpful no matter what. And just as a quick reminder, I'm not going to cover this today, but when we're talking about audio files, there are such a broad range of file formats out there. But for our purposes, the two most important are the WAV file. That's the best for editing and for long-term preservation. That's the larger file. And then that compressed MP3, which is best for sharing audio files. And we'll keep in mind that whatever audio editing software we're using, whether it's Audacity or Audition or GarageBand or something else, they have other other file formats for the actual project workspace, and those are proprietary formats. The WAV and the MP3 are interchangeable. Almost every platform will be able to read those or render those. So it's really, again, just important to know that you want what file format is good for what kind of purpose. So that WAV file is good for the preservation, MP3 is good for streaming on the web or emailing around. And it's good to sort of have a sense of what tools you're working with and what kind of file formats they can read before you get started. But if you end up down a path where you have a file format that you can't open in a particular piece of software, you can use some of the online converters that I've listed here. So I've had to extract M4A audio files from my smartphone and then convert them to either WAV or MP3 using like the online audio converter. And you can grab these slides and follow those links out. But as much as you can plan ahead, the easier it's going to be in your production phase. Let me pause here and see, I've got a question coming in. Okay, that's just a that's cool comment, so thank you very much. Okay, so now I have two sort of pop quizzes for you as we start to talk about file naming. And let me grab the first one. Okay. So this first poll asks you, or this pop quiz, to determine which of these file names is the best. You'll get to vote, and then we'll talk for a few minutes about why we think one is better than the others. So take just a moment to fill out the poll. And I see I think almost everyone's filled it out. Actually, I think we're waiting for one more person, but in the interest of time, oh, good, everybody's voted. So let me end the poll. Okay, and let's take a look. And I don't know if you can see the poll results. I hope you can, but you can see that everybody said that the final file name was the best. This one here, LAC final paper, English 562, 520. And I think we can all imagine why that is. It's the most descriptive. It's got my name. It's got the thing it is, that is the final paper. It's got the course that it's for and the semester. And that's really important because now when I know it's time to turn in all of my final papers for all of my classes, I don't have to worry about submitting my English 562 paper to my History 455 class. There's not any room for mistake there. And that seems pretty clear. And so when we talk about file naming, we want to try to adhere to a few good best practices. The first is that we want to keep short but meaningful titles, preferably under 25 characters, but I tend to abuse that and often go above 25 characters. But it's really good to have short and meaningful file names, where we pick 2 to 3 important attributes to describe and find. So here, I've got multiple attributes. I've got my name, the assignment, the class, and the semester. We want to apply that same file naming standard to both the individual files and the folders, that folder directory structure. And one of the reasons that it's good to have a lot of detail in the individual file name, that docx, is that if, God forbid, my computer crashed and I had to recover files, I might not be able to recover the folder directory structure. And so if I just had a bunch of LAC final paper fall 20 files, I might not be able to figure out immediately which is for which class unless I opened each file up. So having a little bit more information in the file name protects against some sort of corrosion of the file directory structure. Um, Unless you're the type of person who just has like one folder for each semester. I'm a folder among subfolder, subfolder, subfolder kind of person. I'm very hierarchical in my file structure. We also, especially when we're talking about podcasts, we want to have file names that are web appropriate, that will render nicely on the web. So we want to make sure that we avoid special characters, particularly the ampersand or the tilde or something like that, the $sign. We want to avoid spaces. Back in the old days, when we would file transfer our individual files to a directory to render our websites, if we had spaces in our file names, that would translate into a URL, because you can't have spaces in a URL, it would translate into like a %20, and that would make for a really ugly URL. So we want to use underscores or hyphens, or if you're comfortable smushing words together, you can do that as well. And then if you have a sequence of items and you want to sort them and you're numbering them, it's always best to start with what we call a leading zero. That's a 0, 1 instead of 1. Because if you have 9 items, that's fine, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But when you introduce 10 and above, it can potentially reorder things out of sequence based on the numbers from left to right. So if you think you're going to have 100 things, you could have 2 leading zeros or 3 leading zeros, depending on how much stuff you have. Now, not all directories will order things that way, but it's just a good practice. Any questions about that before we get to the next thing? Okay. Oops. Okay, now let's talk about versioning. So take a look at these file names. For just a moment, I'm going to launch our second sort of pop quiz or poll, and I'm going to ask you to vote on the version that you think is the final version of the conference paper. So let me do that. And once everybody's had a chance to vote, we'll talk about this. And while you're voting, I will just say that this example is pulled from a real life example of a dear friend of mine back in North Carolina who actually used this kind of file naming structure and then was getting ready to present at a conference and was not sure which version was the version that she was supposed to use. So I see waiting for one more vote to come in. But I might just go ahead and end the poll now in the interest of time. Okay, let's take a look at the results. And hopefully you can see what I see. And we can see there's no consensus. So 2 people thought the first file name was the best. 1 person thought the second to last one was, and 3 people thought the last one was. Now, in all honesty, who knows? I don't know which is the final version. And it's really unclear. Perhaps, we could count the number of finals. So the third one has 3 finals in it, and maybe that's the final one, or maybe the caps are telling me that's the final version. It's not clear. And I will say that for folks who think that there are ways of sort of deducing, and one of them is to look at the metadata around the file. And we can see the date modified. And we could assume that the most recently modified file is the final version. But I would caution you to be careful about that, because let's say you open up draft 3 of 5 drafts and you accidentally open that up, and maybe you accidentally hit your keyboard and you type something and then you undo it. That then appears in the metadata as the last modified file, even though it's only your third of 5 drafts. So we can't 100% rely on the date modified metadata of the file name. And that's why we want to think about versioning. So there's a lot of different ways to version your files, and there's not necessarily one perfect way or 100% correct way. It's about having a system that works for you. For me, I like to start with the year and I do year, month, day. Some people like to put dashes in between the year, the month, and the day. I don't because I have such long file names that I'm trying to stay under 25 characters. So once you train your brain to see the date sort of in reverse, you can see that that then orders the files based on date. And then I like to add another attribute to sort of the version number. So you can see on July 8th, 2019, that was the original podcast file. The next day I revised it. And then the next day after that, that's the final version. So I've built in sort of multiple ways of confirming just by looking at the file name that this is the most recent version. Um, and one of the things that I like to do is when I hit certain milestones in editing, whether it's an audio file or a text file, is I'll make a copy and sort of start versioning from there. So rather than just only working in the draft, I'll have a draft and then I'll make a copy, redate it, and call it like draft 2 or something. And what's really nice is that a lot of our audio editing software kind of helps us do this. So whenever you open a file in Audacity, it asks you, do you want to open the original file or do you want to make a copy? And I always opt to open a copy. And then as we saw 2 weeks ago with Audition, when you're working in a project workspace in Audition and you've got individual files in there, you can edit the file without it impacting the original file. You always want to keep a sort of good, clean version of that original file that you're not modifying so that if you ever have to go back to it, it's sort of there, it's untouched, you can always start over. The key here is to pick a process, pick a file naming convention and a versioning approach, and be explicit with yourself. And if you're working in a team, with your team. So to document that, how you're going to name your files and how you're going to version them, like at what point are you going to create a new version of things? You want to document that and then you want to stick to that. And once you make it a habit and sort of muscle memory, it's going to really pay off in the long run because it's really going to minimize confusion with your files. It just takes a little bit of setting up and sort of mental energy to think about how you want to do that. Okay, and then we always want to have backups. We can't rely on just one thing. So we like to follow the 3-2-1 rule, where you have 2 copies sort of on site, one on your local computer and one on some sort of external device, whether it's a flash drive or a hard drive, and then one off site in the cloud. And of course, some of us have we might not have access to unlimited cloud backup or cloud storage. So, if you don't have a lot of space, you might think about parking versions of files in your cloud and then removing them once you have a final version, but always backing up the essential files. And the reason we want to do this is that any one of these pieces of technology can fail at any time. And I'm not trying to scare anybody, but your computer can crash, your hard drive can get corroded or corrupted, the cloud can crash every so often. Google goes down for an hour or so. So we want to build in those redundancies so that that never becomes an impediment to us finishing our podcasts. Any questions about that? Okay, I'm going to continue, and then if a question pops up, I can definitely answer that. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about managing our files, I want to introduce a concept of project management. And some of you might have heard this term before, and for some of you, it might be completely new. And some of you might think this doesn't apply to me. This is also something I really love talking about. So I'm going to try not to geek out too much and not take up too much of our time just thinking about project management. But we can think about project management as whether it's a specific job or a role or just a set of activities that helps us get from start to finish. So it helps us get through the project life cycle. And here, when I say project, I'm not just talking about podcasting. It can be any kind of project, analog or digital. It can be solo or collaborative. And you can think about all sorts of things as projects. You're landscaping your yard, that's a project. You're learning how to bake a pie crust, that's a project. You're writing a paper for a class, definitely a project. some of these techniques that I'm going to show you can help you get through that process. And in particular, we're going to be talking about this iterative digital project lifecycle, which is something we talked about way back in mid-September at the first podcasting workshop. And as I'm going through this, I really want to encourage you to think about project management as a set of techniques that you already know how to do. Whether you're teaching or you're doing research, you are engaging in project management all the time, whether you realize it or not. So I'm trying to encourage you to think about your own process and think about your own structures and of how you do things, and think about how you might want to use these tools to help you, again, stay organized, stay on track. So a lot of folks run screaming from the room when I mention project management, and they think it sounds like so much work and such a waste of time to spend all this time setting things up rather than just jump in and do the project. But what I would argue is that, if you put the time in up front, just as you do to sort of figuring out how you're going to manage your files, that time pays off in the end. And so what I'm going to show you is by no means sort of dogma, right? Like, this is all suggested things you can do that you can adapt as you need to, in ways that make sense to you, and if you're working collaboratively, to your team. This is never intended to get in the way of your work. It's a set of tools to aid you. So I would argue that taking a little bit of time to intentionally apply some of these techniques at the beginning of a project will have big payoffs at the end, because you'll have a sort of smoother process. And another real benefit of project management, and I've been a project manager for about a decade now, is that it really helps you focus on the details of your work without losing sight of that bigger picture. So project managers routinely have to sort of traverse the big and the macro and the micro at the same time. So I have to hone in on a very particular thing that I need to get done, and I can end up going down a rabbit hole about that one thing. But I have to always remember what that end goal is, right? I don't want to lose track of the larger purpose of what I'm doing. And then if you're working in a team, particularly virtually now, these approaches will help you track your processes and hand work back and forth between team members. And sort of build in a little bit of accountability. So that's going to be really, really critical. So we talked in the very first workshop about the podcasting creation lifecycle as an iterative digital project lifecycle, where we engage in planning and pre-production. We actually record and gather our sound. We edit, mix, remix, and to create that final podcast. Step 4 is something we haven't really talked about here, but I can point you to some resources if you're interested. If you're going to be submitting your podcast to, say, Apple Podcasts or similar, there's a process whereby you index, create metadata, and validate your metadata before you submit, so that your podcast can be pulled into the RSS feed. And then you submit it, and you watch the number of listens climb, and you garner your praise and you celebrate your success, and then you move on to the next podcast. Now, one of the things that a lot of project managers will do, or most of the good ones will do, is engage in a process of backward design. It's kind of like reverse engineering. So you think about where you want to end up, and you figure out how you're going to get there. So you think about all the things you have to do to produce that podcast, and then you figure out the chunks of tasks you have to do. When you need to get things done, those are your milestones. So, if I have a month to produce a podcast, then by the end of week 1, I better have a topic figured out and whatever interviews I'm going to do lined up and scheduled and all of that. And by the end of week 2, I better have engaged in the interviews. And by week 3, identify all the sound and do the editing to leave me time to revise, remix, all of that good stuff. And with all of this, we, again, always want to focus on that big picture. What is the goal, the purpose? What is it why am I doing this? We never want to lose sight of that. With most podcasts, maybe not entertainment podcasts, but scholarly podcasts, other kinds of creative podcasts, there's usually some sort of argument or narrative thread that we want to focus on. And we need to know what that is as we get started. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a whole bunch of random stuff that isn't really related. So we need to know, what is this podcast about? Whether it's a single episode or a series, what is the through line there? And then once we figured that out, we can know, okay, what do I absolutely have to have to create this podcast? So I need an interview with person X, but it would be great if I had an interview with person Y as well. Don't need to have it, but it would be nice. So we want to sort of figure out what's essential and what's the, like, would be nice if there's time and resources, so that we're focusing our time on the essential stuff. And if there's time and resources left over, we can focus on that optional stuff. We always want to think about our audience, both our intended audience and our unintended audiences. And then again, thinking about what we have and what we need, with that emphasis on essential need, at least right now. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of different templates that can help you get started. These are suggestions, and these are tools you can use. These are not meant to be prescriptive. So some folks will see these templates and run screaming for the hills. Others will say, right on, this is exactly what I want. These are meant as starting places for you to either adopt or adapt as you need, either now or in the future. And we're going to be looking at 3 templates: a scoping document, a planning document, and a sort of tracking document. And these are all living documents that should be updated iteratively, which is to say, you don't just start the project, fill these out, and then that's it. And all of these templates are located at this URL that I pasted in chat, the URL for all of the resources for the workshop series, tinyurl.com/podcast-series-F20. And you can make a copy of them, you can download them, you can add them to your own Google Drives, and adapt them as you need them. And in fact, these are templates that I have adapted from others over many years. So the first one is the project scope. And this provides that broad user-centered overview, like, what's the big picture of my podcast or my project? What are my outcomes and deliverables? If I'm working with a group of people, what are our individual roles and responsibilities? And then what's in and out of scope? This safeguards against a thing called scope creep, which I'm always guilty of. So I'm the person in the room when we're brainstorming who's like, whoa, wouldn't it be awesome if we did this? And then everyone has to yell at me, scope creep, like, yeah, that would be awesome, but that's not what we're here to do. Let me just pull that out and show you what that looks like. I should have preloaded this. I didn't think to do that. And while I'm waiting for it to load, I'm just going to go back to the slide. Sorry about that. Okay, the next document that we're going to talk about is the work plan. This allows you to identify and sort of map out all of the things you think you need to do to get this project done. So we can imagine for a podcast, it would be, in addition to all the research we need to do and the brainstorming, we would want to be scripting or coming up with research questions. We would need to be doing all the recording, locating and downloading all the additional audio files we need, the background music, the sound effects, and then all of the editing we would need to do. And then we're going to identify what's called task dependencies, and I'll come back to that concept in just a moment. We'll then use this plan to establish a broad schedule with those milestones. And I always say, in the digital, things always take longer than you think they're going to. I've been managing projects for, as I said, a decade, and still I'm always slightly surprised that things take longer than I think they are. And I'm really good at building in a cushion to how much time I think I need. Again, this is where, if you are working in a team, you're going to assign tasks to team members, and that allows you to create that accountability. And then there's a work log, where you can track the work done and the work left to do. You can document problems and workarounds that you developed. If you are working on an ongoing project with a team, this would be a way to fill in gaps between meetings rather than having to sit at each meeting and remember what it was you did each time. And you can keep it at any interval of time. So let's go and look at these documents really quickly. I'm hoping that my drive will actually open. Perfect. So here's the project scope. And again, this is just a Word Google Doc. You can do this in any format, but you can see a sort of it asks for a brief description of the project. If there's a project history, that is, let's say this is phase 2 of a long-term project, the goals that you want, if you have stakeholders, your audience, and all the team roles. And not all of this is necessarily going to be relevant to every single project. So of course, you can adapt this as you need to. The needs you think you have. And this is good too, right? Like, well, I know I need editing software. I know I need sound. I know I need other things like that. I also know I need to learn how to use Audition better. So that would be a need you'd want to identify. And you'd want to try to fold in time for that. This is the work plan. This is a spreadsheet. I know not everybody likes using spreadsheets, so you don't have to use that. And again, I'll talk about dependent tasks in just a moment. But this just asks you to sort of break down into the component pieces. If we're thinking in terms of a recipe, these would be the ingredients you would need, where you'd put each task or ingredient in one as a single row in the spreadsheet. And then the work log. This is also a doc. You can document this in any way you like. But if you're working on a project over the long term and you're not working on it daily, it's really easy to forget what you've done. So it's always a good idea to do some kind of project documentation. And so you can see here, I repeat some of the content, the overview of the project, right? I want to keep an eye on that big picture. I want to look at the significant things we've accomplished and then what we've done since the last time I've used the work log. So whether it's a day, a week, a month, whatever, and then any challenges, and then what's the next phase of work to be done. And this helps me stay focused and on task. Any questions about that before I move on? And again, I would say that these are tools that you can use as they make sense to you. But the concepts represented in these tools are really good things to put into practice at whatever scale you need for the project you're working on. If you're
Are
working
those forms?
solo, oh, sorry.
Sorry, Pam, excuse me. Are those forms that you just showed us somewhere, or is that just these are just
Yes. So if you click this link, the tiny
oh,
URL,
great.
there's
There's
a folder just for those templates. Thank you. Yeah. And so as I was starting to say, if you're working by yourself on a project, you might not need to keep the formal forms, those formal templates up to date, but you always want to document what you've done, right? Like if you're working on a semester-long research project, you want to keep some sort of journal of what it is you've done so that you're not reinventing the wheel constantly. Now, let me take a moment to talk about dependencies and parallel processes. Now, a task dependency is a task that can't be started until another task is done. So in the context of podcasting, what that means is you can't edit a sound file before you have the sound file. So whether you're recording or grabbing files from elsewhere, you obviously can't edit something that doesn't yet exist or isn't in your possession. And so it can be really stressful if you're new to editing in particular, to say, okay, I've now got all of the stuff recorded, but now I only have so much time to edit all the files. And so a trick that I learned many, many years ago that's really served me well is to try to break those dependencies apart and to do things in parallel processing. And this is especially important if you're part of a team where you have very clearly delineated roles. Let's say one person on the team is designated to be mixing the sounds together at the end. If if you're waiting until the very end of the process to hand over all the files, that member of the team is just going to be sitting idle for a good chunk of time, and then it's going to have to scramble to edit everything to make the deadline. So in this case, in the context of podcasting, we can think about recording chunks of audio and then editing those chunks while we're creating more sound. So we're doing it in sort of cycles and then putting it all together at the end. And this would be a way to keep everybody contributing throughout the process. And especially if you have the learning curve of needing to, really become skilled at editing software, it builds in some time for practice, right? If you start with one audio file, you start editing it, you're still editing it, or maybe you've turned it over to someone else while you're recording more. So you're sort of iteratively building, and it allows you to get to that finish line a little bit less stressed out, um, because you're sort of not waiting for one thing to end before you can start another thing. Just checking to see if there are any questions. It doesn't look like it. Couple other things to consider, whether we're talking about podcasting or other kinds of digital projects. Some things that you want to factor into your planning: technological hurdles and constraints. And I sort of mentioned this a little bit, but things take a lot longer in the digital. You need time to identify and learn the tools that you need. And sometimes that means that you start with one software and you realize you don't like it and you have to switch to another one. You need time to figure out how to get things into your platform and learn how to really use that. And then you have to sort of plan for tech fails. I always joke, not joke really, but caution that technology fails you when you need it the most. And so you want to try to build a buffer in for that, right? If you have to turn in a podcast for a class on a Friday, you don't want to wait till Thursday night to start editing, because something could happen. Something could happen to your computer, to the software, who knows? If you're working collaboratively on a project or a podcast, there's additional hurdles that you want to factor in for. Coordinating schedules is a big one. And anyone who's ever been on a committee knows that, like, just scheduling the meetings at a time that everyone can meet um, feels like a victory in and of itself. And we also need to think about equitable divisions of labor and systems of accountability. How many of you have been in a group project where someone has sort of skated and you've done all the work? This happens all the time. And it can still happen even using some of these tools, but at least we want to bake in some accountability. And then, of course, when we're talking about podcasting, we have so many different types of content we're keeping track of, different audio files, and they're in different formats. And again, that's why we want those good file management practices. We want to make sure that we have a folder dedicated to all of the stuff for a particular podcast. And we might consider subfolders. One is voice files, and one is background music, and one is sound effects, and one is for scripting. And even though that requires a lot more clicking among the folders, there's no confusion as to what is what. And similarly, if you're working with others, you need to think about how you're going to hand off work. And this can be tricky, particularly in our virtual moment, particularly if we're working across different time zones. So if you are doing anything collaboratively, you want to think about and have an explicit agreement with your teammates about how you're going to communicate the status of particular tasks, how you're going to let someone know when you're done with something and it's their turn to work on it, what kind of problems or issues you encountered and how you solved those. Because chances are, if you hit a problem, someone else is going to find that same problem. So if you develop a workaround, be kind to your teammates and share that workaround with them so they don't have to start over. And again, you want to be consistent in how you're handling your file names and how you're storing everything in your file directory. There should be no confusion. There's confusion enough when we work solo, and when we add multiple people into the mix, that's just all the more reason to be really, really careful and to document the decisions you make, right? We're going to use this file naming structure and this file directory structure, and we're all going to stick to it. There's lots of great tools that can help you out. There are classic project management tools. I've used Trello for or just about a decade, but there's also Asana. Google has a version called Keep, which is, I've not used it very much, but it works just fine. A lot of folks use Slack, and I use Slack quite a bit as well. And Slack is great for both communication and file sharing, for those of you who've used it before. You can also use Google tools. And in fact, one of the things I really like about Google, if you don't want to learn a new tool, is any kind of Google Doc that you're working in, you can use the tagging and assigning feature in the comments to assign tasks to people. So here I've got a little screenshot. I'm assigning work to myself. I'll get an email alert that I've been assigned that. And then once it's done, I would resolve that comment so everyone who's in that doc can see that I've done it. And there's like a record of that. So that helps with that accountability. Questions about that? Okay, so we have not quite 50, but just about 15 minutes to talk a little bit about now how do we apply this to podcasting? So how do we've talked about, big picture podcasting, we've talked about some of the mechanics. So now we're going to zoom back out and think about, all right, how do we actually get started with a podcast? And as with everything else I've said today, these are just some suggestions. And it's really about being aware of your own preferences and processes and just being intentional about those processes. And so there's no one right way to do this, as long as you're doing some planning work. I've talked to some students over the years who just like to dive in and start doing. And that kind of horrifies me because, in case you couldn't tell, I'm a planner. I really like to plan things. I want everything kind of orchestrated. And even no matter how much I plan things, things can go awry. And so, you don't want to get stuck in the planning phase, but a little bit of planning goes a long way. So I'm going to share a couple of different techniques. Again, this is about finding what fits for you. And you might not see anything here that fits, and you might need to sort of piece things together. But the idea is to figure out a way that works for you. So three possible techniques are to plan based on visualizing, studying, or organizing. And in case you couldn't guess, my preferred method is the organizing or outlining process. That's just kind of the structured person I am. But that's just me. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways that we can visualize a podcast. And you could think, well, podcasts are audio. How do I visualize sound? And it's not explicitly the sound we're thinking about, but the story, the actual shape of the podcast that we're going to try to visualize. And we can think about a pathway visualization where we have a starting point and we have an ending point, and we have an idea of where we want to go and how much we want to meander. What does our audience need to get them through that journey? We could also try this center and spokes model where you've got sort of the main sort of focus of your podcast or the main argument, and then all the sort of pieces coming off of that and how they all relate to each other, what kinds of transitions you need from, say, spoke 1 to spoke 3. Or if you prefer, you can use this connecting the dots method. This is kind of like a mind map. And I have to admit, personally, I am very bad at mind mapping. It's just not, my brain doesn't function this way, but a lot of people really love mind mapping. So if you're the kind of person who loves mind mapping, this is a method that's going to help you, where you have lots of different ideas and you're just sort of figuring out how they connect. So you're sort of getting all your ideas out, figuring out the relationship between those ideas, and out of that, some sort of structure for your podcast can emerge. For those of you who want to be more analytical about it, not that the visualizing approach isn't analytical, I don't mean to suggest that. You can use this approach where you might analyze a really good podcast episode and a bad one. And you want to articulate all of the elements that make it either successful or unsuccessful. So you want to think about things like, how long is each segment of the podcast? What do their transitions sound like? What's the relationship of the words to the music? How much sound effects are being used? How often do they go on a tangent, and am I able to follow? And of course, how we define a successful or an unsuccessful podcast is often in the ear of the beholder, right? Like, I might really love one podcast and Linda might really hate it. So it's ultimately thinking about the type of podcast you want to emulate, whether it's stylistically or the genre or something like, or the sound, the feel of the soundscape, and thinking about what is it about that podcast that speaks to you, and how can you kind of recreate that? What are the elements you need? And then figuring out from there how you're going to make that work for your particular episode or your series of episodes. And then if you're the structured kind of anal retentive person like me, I'm the type of person who just wants to sort of outline everything. So I'm going to sort of think through, okay, here's my topic, here are all the main ideas I want to hit, here are all the elements I need. I'm going to figure out exactly how many words I need in my script to fill 20 minutes of time. And then I'm going to organize it and outline it until I've over outlined it. And then I'll actually maybe script it and then do it. And again, there's no one right way to do this. It's about finding a technique that speaks to you and your existing processes. So a couple things to consider regardless of the approach you take is about the interplay of those elements and finding a balance, right? You don't want just voice with no background music. You don't want the background music to overpower the voice. You want that balance. You do need to factor in timing and transitions. So you don't just want to move from one idea to another without either some musical shift, an interlude to sort of cue people's ears to a new topic or something like that. You want to think about tone and mood and how the soundscape that you're building, it all is related, right? The voice, the voices, the words, the stories with the music. The music helps set that tone. If you're dealing with something really serious, you probably don't want to use really upbeat music, right? And if you're dealing with something really happy and funny, you want to kind of have perky music. And you want to think again, focus on that big picture. Everything needs to sort of enhance that central thread that you're trying to pull out, whether it's a scholarly argument or some other kind of story. What is the main focus here of this episode or this podcast series? And how am I going to help my listeners follow that thread throughout? So these are some of the questions you're going to want to ask yourself throughout your creation process. And then you're going to pick the path that's right for you. So for some of you, it might be follow your tried and true writing processes where you start with an idea or a question, you do a bunch of research, note taking, outlining, you write, you rewrite, and then you start recording it. Others might want a storyboard where you actually have almost like a comic, you have panels and you're sort of chunking out parts of the podcast. All right, so this first 5 minutes, it's going to be banter between the hosts, and then we're going to dive into the topic, and then we're going to do this. If you're interviewing, you want to think about, doing the research you need to do the interview, and then you want to get those questions ready. And then depending on your comfort level, of how much you want to script versus how much you want to improvise, you want to plan for that as well. So if you're doing an interview, you want to have questions ready to go. But you also want to be prepared to go off script, right? You want to listen to the person you're talking to and be responsive. And that might mean going in a path you weren't quite expecting. Or it might mean having to shift back to the original questions if you've gone too far astray, so that you can get back to that main purpose of that podcast, right? Okay, at this point, I'm going to stop sharing. We've got a few minutes left. I'm going to put a few links in chat and open it up to any questions, observations, comments, or things folks want to share. And I want to just remember that we do have a feedback form, and I would welcome your feedback, particularly because, oops, I sent that to just one person. We're working on the virtual programming for the spring semester, and I'm trying to decide whether to rerun the podcasting workshop, possibly in a more compressed way, weekly instead of bi-weekly, or to just move on to something else because we have everything recorded. So any kind of feedback you can provide would be super helpful. So please do fill out that link. And also, as a reminder of some podcasting resources from the DH Center, I'm going to pop those in chat as well. But any questions or stories folks want to share in our last couple minutes together?
Pam, this is Linda. Have you, and you may have said this in one of your previous classes, but have you done a podcast series yourself?
Oh, that's a really good question.
What did you think? How did it?
So this is hilarious. I'm laughing because no, I've not ever done a podcast.
Oh.
I have taught podcasts to many classes, and we run a podcasting institute with the National Humanities Center as well for doctoral students across the country. But I have never myself produced one. And all of the sound editing I've done has been like sound files of under a couple of minutes. So this is a great example of like, I guess, I mean, I could do one. It's not like a those who can't teach kind of thing, but I don't have any actual experience podcast. This is based on research I've done, talking to other podcasters, and learning the techniques, as well as pulling in my project management experience.
Well, based on the other podcasters you've talked to, have you noticed a trend in a particular type of podcast that people tend to have feel like they're having success with?
Oh, that's a great question. I think my response is slightly skewed because I mostly talk to scholarly podcasters. Um, and we're seeing a lot of success with scholarly podcasting right now. In fact, there's a scholar, Hannah McGregor, up in Canada who's been working on peer review for podcasting with a publisher.
Oh, nice.
So scholarly podcasting has really taken off, not solely as a sort of way to promote your traditional so-called research, but as a form of research in and of itself. And I've heard that there are some graduate programs that are considering podcasts as a format for dissertations and theses, which would be really awesome. Um, so I'm not so from that perspective, those kinds of podcasts have been very successful, and I see more and more scholarly podcasts being launched. But there's so many other kinds, journalistic ones, entertainment, comedy, sports. This is a real moment for podcasting, and it's funny because podcasts had like this peak several years ago, and then it looked like they were starting to peter out a little, and then like a year or two ago, they started to really tick up again. And I think that the pandemic, we've seen even a greater increase in podcasts because it's a more accessible kind of technology than, say, video production. It's something that a lot of folks can do, even just using their smartphones. We've got a student up at UC San Diego. He's a music student, and he's been working with local school kids, just using the technology they have at home to record themselves and edit and create podcasts. So it's a really accessible format for so many people.
That's
And because there's
great.
such a broad range of types, there's sort of something for everybody there. So it's a really rich moment for podcasting. That didn't
Thank
quite
you.
answer your question, though. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, no, it did. It really did.
Other questions? Or is anyone here podcasting right now? We've had some folks in the past join us who are doing podcasting. Yeah,
I
Suzanne.
am. I'm podcasting right now.
Awesome.
We're building a podcast for the Department of European Studies.
Oh,
So
fantastic.
they're having right. So we're having a 20-year anniversary, and we're going to launch the podcast, kind of like tease it and unveil it during the anniversary. So we have the content already recorded for the first episode, and I'm working on editing it. I need to figure out how to get that metadata into the RSS feeds and like how to choose a platform where to so I'm going to need help with that. I'm probably going to send you an email.
Yes, I was. Please do. I've got lots of information about how to do that, particularly if
Cool.
you want to submit to Apple Podcasts. And I've seen a lot of people submit to multiple platforms. So the Future Faculties Initiative here at SDSU that Joanna Brooks is running, they've been submitting to SoundCloud and Apple Podcasts. And so
Yeah.
they have sort of two different places where they're listing theirs. But if you send me an email, and I'll put my email in chat in case you weren't able to
Yeah,
grab it.
I've totally got your email from past sessions, but thank
Awesome.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll send you an email about that. We're trying to we set up like a blog page on the department website that will go live also on the same night. So it's kind of like this big reveal for the end of the semester, and like very
Awesome.
cool thing.
That's really
Yeah,
cool.
thank you.
And I will say, and I can't recall if you were at the first workshop back in
Yeah.
September, but one of our
Mhm.
participants there, who's up at UC Irvine, she does the podcasting series for the history department there, was
Okay.
asking about sort of teasers and trailers and things like that. And so,
Right.
if you have the time, you can think about a little teaser, a little
Yeah.
soundbite that sort of is a cliffhanger that you could release before you go live to sort of build
Right.
up excitement.
Right. I had to kind of do that a little bit for a department meeting anyway. So I've got a little, what is it? Is it like a 3-minute teaser? But I
Nice.
think I can like tie it down a little bit more to like 30 or 60 seconds, right?
Perfect. Yeah, that's
The
great.
industry
Wonderful.
standard. Yeah. Thank you so much, Pam. I have to go to another meeting. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. And I look forward to hearing from you. So just send me an email when you're ready.
Thank you.
Sure. So we are at the end of our time. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I'm going to stop recording, but I'll hang out in the Zoom room if there are any more questions. But thank you all for joining me on this 5-session journey over, I guess, 10 weeks or maybe longer. I have lost all sense of time. This has been really fun, and someday I will be able to do these workshops face to face in our Digital Humanities Center, but glad you were able to join us over Zoom. So thank you, stay safe, stay healthy, wear a mask, and I'll see you soon.